Welcome back from lunch. I have the distinct privilege and honor of trying to keep you awake as you try to lull to sleep after such a great lunch. Thank you for joining us in this session, and thank you for having me here. I have been to the Netherlands many times. This is actually my first time to Utrecht, so fantastic city, beautiful. Got to walk around a little bit, but I'm glad to be here. Quick PSA before I get started, because a lot of you still think of me as being on Twitter with the handle Getify. I'm known as Getify in lots of places online, but I don't do Twitter anymore because people treat each other so poorly on there. So there is a Twitter Getify account, but I don't use it anymore. It's been deactivated for like 2 years, so stop following me. I don't know why people still follow an inactive account from 2 years ago. All right. I can't see many of you, but hopefully I'm going to be able to approximate here. So I need a quick show of hands. How many of you have felt at some point or another in your career some symptoms of what you might call imposter syndrome? Can I see a raise of hands? Okay. I'm seeing quite a few hands. That's good. I did see more hands not go up than I expected, and I'm wondering if those of you who didn't put your hands up the first time, maybe you feel imposter syndrome about your imposter syndrome. Anybody in here like that? I certainly feel that way. All right, so I do have some things to share with you about, I'm going to share with you some confessions as an imposter myself, and you might be wondering, does that mean that I like to play the game Among Us? No, that's just my kids that play Among Us. We're going to talk about a different kind of imposter. So I want to use the dictionary definition for imposter, and I want to highlight specifically that it is somebody who intentionally practices deception. That's how we typically think of this word. So there's an obvious negative connotation that somebody who is intentionally trying to deceive other people, they have a malintent. Like their goal is to try to create confusion, deception among the people around them. They are trying to pull one over on people. And there are literally professional people who have made their entire careers being con men or being imposters. And I want to set that aside because I do not think that's the appropriate way of thinking about being an imposter. That is certainly not what's actually driving imposter syndrome. Because imposter syndrome is actually a psychological occurrence. And it actually causes you to have doubts and fears about your own skills and talents. And what I want you to see there is that there is actual latent skill and talent that you possess, and yet it is your brain trying to trick you into thinking that you don't have those skills and talents or that they're not good enough. That is not somebody who is intentionally trying to deceive other people. Okay, that's a different sort of a thing. And so today, my thoughts on imposter syndrome, I'm going to try to reframe this topic from being this negative thing that we're scared by and that we try to shy away from, and instead think of it as something that we should embrace, that we should run towards. We have to reframe our thinking around this notion of impostorism. Before I go any further, I do need to give you some disclaimers. First of all, I am not a doctor nor a psychologist, if that's not obvious enough. And there are many, many professionals in those fields that have actually studied imposter syndrome, and they have lots of fantastic research and actual knowledge on this topic. And I don't want you to hear any of what I have to say today to be contradicting them in any way. Okay? Imposter syndrome is a real experience that people have, and I don't mean to diminish that. Secondly, this disproportionately affects people from often underrepresented groups. Some of you have a reality that is not one that I can even understand. It is not a lived experience that I have. And some of you have felt the impact of imposter syndrome much more greatly than even myself has. And I want to just say right now that I don't mean to in any way diminish the experience, the real lived experience that you've had. And thirdly, many others have actually articulated far greater thoughts and helpful and insightful advice on this topic than I have. In fact, I did a lot of research in preparing for this talk on the topic of imposter syndrome, and I found such great advice out there, and I wanted to highlight a couple of quotes from one particular article and video that I think you should watch. This is from Louise Curtis, coins this notion of concert imposter syndrome. Basically, to summarize, concert imposter syndrome is like when you're at a concert with your favorite band and you're up in the front row and you're singing along to the lyrics of this band and you're having a great time, and then you look to the left or the right of you and you realize that somebody else knows more of the lyrics than you do. And so all of a sudden you start feeling like you're not a good enough fan because they know more lyrics than you. And it's a really great metaphor for talking about how we feel in our careers. And I don't want you to just take that summary and go on. I actually do want you to go and read this article, and there's an accompanying TEDx talk by him. But I wanted to pull out 2 quotes from near the end, because I thought Louise said this so well. When I feel imposter syndrome start to bite, I know this means I'm passionate about something and that I'm surrounded by the right people to help me improve. She goes on to say, if you're feeling like an imposter, you're probably in the best possible position to learn and grow. All you need to do is embrace the experience. And I just love the spirit of that. I thought that was said so well. In fact, said so well that I started to wonder, do I have anything useful to say on the topic of imposter syndrome? I had some imposter syndrome about this talk itself. And you may be wondering, well, that pretty much says it all. You're about done. We're about ready to wrap. Well, we are going to go in a bit of a different direction. And I hope that you'll stay with me on this. Because as I said, what I want to do is try to reframe this topic from thinking of it as a negative thing into thinking of it as a positive thing. Positive things far more greatly motivate us to do bigger and better things with our career than negative things do. So somebody standing up here and telling you, hey, guess what, you should just ignore this imposter syndrome thing, that's not going to motivate you nearly as much as for me to say, actually, you should run towards impostorism as an identity that you are proud of. And that's what I'm hoping to do by the end of this talk. So I want us to go back to imposter, and I pulled out a thesaurus and found a few words, and I eliminated all the words that obviously have negative connotation to them, but there were a few that stood out that do not have an obvious negative connotation. For example, actor and imitator. We don't think of people who are actors or imitators as intentionally trying to deceive us with some sort of malintent. We actually think of that in a good and positive light as somebody who's trying to entertain us or trying to give us interesting and useful information that we need to hear. But it's this third one that I want to highlight, empiric. This is a word that you may not know itself, but you certainly will recognize it as the root of the word empirical. So what is an empiric? It's an old archaic word. It's not in use much. But it's a person who relies solely on practical experience rather than on scientific principles. Now, I do want to call out that there is a positive and negative way for that to be taken. If you are someone who takes all of the scientific evidence that is presented to you and completely ignores that scientific evidence and just lives in your own little bubble of truth that's not truth to the rest of the world, that's a bad thing, and I'm not in any way endorsing that, okay? And there's plenty of examples of that in our society. But if we turn it on the other side, we can say that a person who is an empiric is also someone who does not wait around to have the credentials granted to them by other people before they start trying to practically observe what's happening in the world around them and to interact with the world around them. You see, it unburdens them from having to wait until they've achieved some measure of success before they ever share any of what they have to say on a topic with other people. I get this question a lot from people, and maybe you've thought this or said this to others. I've had people say it to me already today. I'm working on this thing, and they fill in the name of some project, some talk, something that they're doing. I'm working on this thing, but it's not quite good enough to show others yet. And probably some of you feel that very deeply right now. You probably have something amazing that you've been cooking for quite a long time, but you haven't shown anybody else yet. And you're waiting for that magical moment when it feels okay, it feels good enough for you to show to other people. And I'm going to share with you exactly what I tell people when they bring this up to me or when they ask me advice about this. This is what I tell them. If you wait until you're an expert, you waited too long. Because what motivates us, what drives us as human beings, not even as engineers, but as human beings, is the experience of understanding that we can go along relationally with another person on their journey. It is the journey that matters, not the destination. That's been said many, many times before me, and much more articulately than me, but it is nonetheless true. So if you wait until you've become an expert and you have finished everything that there is to learn and understand about a topic before you ever share that information with anyone else, you waited too long because all of us missed out on the most important part. We missed out on your journey of how you learned and how you grew because we didn't get to go on that journey with you. If you're sitting there thinking, here's something that I'd like to share with other people that I've been learning and that I'm passionate about and that I'm interested about, stop waiting for somebody else to give you the blessing that you're an expert.
You're waiting too long. I want to illustrate this notion, and I hope that some of you in the back are going to be able to see this. I want to illustrate this notion of not waiting or not expecting that you have to be perfect or an expert at something to be able to accomplish a task. So I brought along this shirt here, and I do my own laundry at the house, and invariably, every time that I pull my shirts out of the dryer, they're turned inside out. So I very regularly am constantly doing pulling my shirt all the way through. So that's what I'm doing. I'm just going to invert the shirt. I'm going to pull it all the way through, and then you can see here that on that side it says that was the wrong way to do it. I don't know if that was actually the wrong way to do it, but I was able to invert the shirt, and that's exactly how I do it whenever I'm doing my own laundry. But you notice that I did that through the opening of the neck hole, or whatever that's called. I'm not a garment expert, but whatever that's called, I pulled it through there, and it was a little bit more difficult. Well, it turns out that you can also pull it through the sleeve. So I'm going to invert the whole shirt through the sleeve. And as I shake it out here, sure enough, the shirt has been inverted. Now, some of you are saying, well, why are you doing it the hard way? Why are you doing the more difficult way, pulling it through the smaller holes? Obviously, the right way to do it is to pull it through the big hole at the bottom, right? That's obviously the correct way to invert the shirt because it's so much easier to invert it that way. Now, what I'm trying to illustrate to you, and I know this is a silly illustration, but what I'm trying to illustrate to you is that there are multiple different ways to invert this t-shirt. And I'm not sure that there's one correct, right way. There is, however, a lot of math behind the concept that you can invert it through any one of those holes. And I don't know what any of that math means, by the way. I don't have any foggy clue. So I'm not a mathematics expert, but I'm able to invert the t-shirt. And maybe it's good enough, maybe it's okay that I invert it, even if there was a slightly better way that I could have done it. Maybe it was still perfectly okay that I inverted the t-shirt the way that I did. And I want you to extrapolate beyond t-shirt inversion to lots of other things in our career. That maybe we don't have to be experts at things to actually do them. Sometimes doing is actually the best way to learn. Many of you probably identify with that. I certainly feel that way. Now, I don't mean to say that learning isn't important. I've spent my entire career trying to encourage people that the path to being able to do better is to learn more deeply your tools and to understand them. It's preferable to eventually understand how what you're doing works. But maybe we don't have to wait for a full level of expert understanding to get started. And so many times people feel like, I'm not ready to get started. I'm not ready to show this to other people because I'm not yet an expert. So I'm going to show you a really complicated diagram. Are you ready? Here's the diagram. We're going to start with doing, and that's going to lead to learning, which is then going to lead to more doing. I know, it blows your mind, right? Very complicated concept here. And what I'm getting at is that we need to turn around this concept of being an imposter as this thing that's negative, like you're trying to deceive people, and actually look at the positive side of someone who is not yet an expert, but wants to share something with others, that wants to do publicly. So I'm going to define a new concept, at least I don't think anybody else has called it this. I'm going to define a professional imposter. And this is how I define it. Someone who's passionate enough to do early and often, and they're patiently evolving their observed experience into expertise. But most importantly, they're curious and always willing to ask why and how. Now, I don't know if any of you identify with that as your motivation, as your ethic. I hope some of you do, because this is how I would like for people to describe me on my tombstone someday. This is how I would like people to look back at me. Is that I was curious and I asked why and I asked how and I drove to try to do, even if I didn't have the expertise, the credentials to do so. So I've launched recently a movement that I'm calling the Impostor movement, to be proud of being a professional imposter. And on this website, impostor.ly, I've got the Professional Imposter Manifesto, where I've described this in more detail. And I strongly encourage all of you, if you resonate with this idea that you don't have to wait to be an expert to go out and publicly do in front of others and to make the world better, go and sign the Professional Imposter Manifesto. By the way, the slides for this talk are also at that location. There'll be a link later in the talk. And also, if you do sign that manifesto, come up and let me know. I've got some stickers to give away with the Impostor logo. I know, we got to bribe you with. Okay, so I'm already well into this talk, and you've been thinking, wait a minute, where's the confessions? He said he was going to give us some confessions. So I'm going to talk to you about the last 25 years of my web career. And I'm going to make some confessions about how I've approached it. And I'm going to start with web design. Now, I have a content warning for you because what I'm about to show you is probably going to hurt your eyes. Okay, so just if you're sensitive of eyes, just be aware. I went back into, I know. I went back to archive.org and found all of my old mistakes. These are the first 2 websites I ever designed back in like 99 and 2000. And they're with tables. They're terrible. They're awful. Somehow those people paid me to build that stuff. Right? I think it's quite clear that I'm an imposter as far as web design is concerned. I don't think I need to show you anything else. Now, we fast forward 20 years. I got a bunch of other stuff that I could have embarrassed myself with, but to keep on time, I'm going to fast forward to some things that I've recently designed, and I think I've gotten a little bit better at it, but many of you are still going to say, you should have a real designer design these things. Here's a couple of apps that I recently built. On the left is a flashcards app for my kids to practice their math. It like flips through and you do, testing out math skills and things like that. If you have kids and you want to practice math with them, you can check that out. On the right is this word game. Anybody play Wordle or other word games like that? Okay, I'm super addicted to those. But I do not like word-based games that have both skill and luck involved. And so I wanted to have a game that was entirely skill-based. So I built this different game, came up with this different game concept called Twordly, where you start out with a longer word and you have to change one letter at a time, adding, removing, or changing a letter, get down to a single letter word. And every word in between has to be a real word. Simple game concept, but I built this thing and I put that out there. So the point that I'm trying to make is that I had these ideas for an app, but I'm not an expert designer and I don't have a budget as an individual person to go pay expert designers to do things for me. So I did just enough to get the job done and get my ideas as an app out there. Okay? So, confession number 1, I'm an imposter at web design. Let's talk about HTML. Another one of our core foundational technologies is web builders. I am absolutely an imposter at HTML. So this was a site that I built. It's a very simple little app that I built. I had Kickstarter backers last fall, and I needed to collect survey information, and I couldn't use some of the existing Kickstarter survey software for a couple of reasons. So I built this simple little micro app thing, and this is the markup that I wrote to put into that app. And you'll notice that I'm not doing anything fancy like web components and custom elements and shadow DOM and any of those stuff. I'm just using plain old boring paragraph tags. Because quite frankly, this is about as sophisticated as I get with my markup. I think I'm all right, I'm decent at markup, but I do not have some, advanced level skill in markup. But it was enough that the app was able to work and collect the information that I needed from my backers. I mentioned the flashcards app. This is what it looks like when you're in a timed challenge, and I just wanted to highlight the markup to do that little equation part in the middle, the 7+1 equation part. Again, no fancy custom elements or web components or anything like that. Just some spans and a div, right? Because, and I wired a little bit it up with a little bit of CSS. We'll talk about CSS in a moment. But again, I just needed the bare bones to get something out there so that my kids could practice their math. I didn't have to show off what an expert I was in HTML, because clearly I have subpar HTML skills. In that Twordly game, I have a little light mode, dark mode selector. And I went Googling because what I wanted was somebody that had marked it up semantically as a radio button. Because a lot of the selectors that are out there, the markup and the components that you find for people, they've done it with checkboxes, so it's like on or off. But that's the wrong semantic when you're choosing between 2 affirmative options like light mode and dark mode. So I was like, surely somebody's done this with a radio button and make it look like a little toggle. And I couldn't find anything. Maybe my Google skills are bad, but I couldn't find anything. So I just fiddled around until I was able to invent something. And here's some of the markup that I did for that. And, again, not very sophisticated, just a couple of divs, I've got the input radio on either side of it, and then I'm going to show you in just a moment the CSS for how I make it kind of look like a toggle button, but there's nothing sophisticated going on here. But it's just enough that I'm able to get my ideas out there and get apps built that are able to do useful and interesting things. I do not have to be an HTML expert to use HTML. I've mentioned CSS several times. Let's talk about CSS. There's a whole lot of things that I feel like an imposter at in CSS. Let's go back to that light mode, dark mode selector. How am I marking this up? That's what it looks like when you're in the dark mode. How am I marking this up with the CSS? How am I making it look like the toggle has moved back and forth? Well, I first of all have the input radio is hidden so that I can have my little button showing there, and I just stole that from other people. I don't even know if that's exactly what I should be doing. But I just wanted to note one little thing here. I couldn't figure out how to get the track to show below it until I did z-index -1. That's probably like totally terrible. I don't know, but it worked. And it got the track to show below the thing. I don't know the correct and proper way to do it. Maybe the most sophisticated thing that I'm doing here is I'm using CSS variables and calculations and stuff. I'll talk about that in a minute as well. And then to make the yellow or the black button show up in either side, I just have down there at the bottom. If it's checked, I make it visible. Otherwise, both of them are hidden by default, and then whichever one is checked, I make that particular after element visible. Yeah, this doesn't look like the kind of CSS that I see CSS experts writing, so I'm left to believe that I'm probably not very good at CSS, but it's a functional and workable light mode, dark mode toggle. Let's talk about colors for just a moment, because again, I'm not very sophisticated with color theory, and I just kind of amateurly thought that if I was going to have a light mode color scheme that looked good, to do the dark mode, I just needed to flip the light and the dark colors, and that's what I thought I needed to do, and I tried it and it looked terrible. So it turns out that there's a lot more to the science of light mode and dark mode and making things look nice, and I'm not at all an expert on those things, but I had these colors that looked in my light mode, and I had to use different colors for the dark mode because I couldn't just flip things. So I had to do like that little yellow orange color because otherwise it wasn't standing out, a few other things like that. Contrast ratios, we'll talk about that in a moment. That's another big problem that you have to deal with when you're switching between light mode and dark mode. Speaking of colors, I again want very unsophisticated. I want to be able to define a color once in a CSS variable and then be able to conditionally apply different amounts of opacity, different alpha to that color. And I could not figure out any other way to do that other than to store the colors in this weird like RGB comma separated list. And then you'll notice on the next to last line down there, I'm able to conditionally use the same color in two different places but apply a different opacity with the RGBA function. I don't know, there's probably a way better way of doing this. But I'm not sophisticated enough to use like all the fancy CSS processors or CSS and JS builders or all that other stuff. This is just some static CSS that I wrote to try to get the job done. Let's talk about layout. That's another big issue in CSS. I know for 15 years of our industry at least, we've been talking about the merits of responsive design. And confession time, I'm completely an imposter and I don't have any idea how people come up with good, nice, interesting layouts that look so different on all these different size screens. I've tried and it always turns out poorly. It turns out terrible. So I'm awful at doing this responsive design in the typical way that people want it to be done. So what I do in my responsive design, this poor man's way of doing it, is I just scale the entire interface based upon the viewport size and orientation. And I literally just calculate the VW and VH units, and then everything is a computation off that. That's why you saw all those calcs. Literally everything, font size, margin, spacing, everything, it's just a calculation off of those things. And then I just use a little bit of tiny JavaScript in the page to keep that updated as the browser window changes its orientation or size. I just re-inject those units and everything recalculates itself. This is probably a terrible idea. But I have heard recently some CSS experts who've been talking about things like fluid design, I think that's what it's called, and it's kind of like this, but maybe they're doing it way better than me, I don't know. But I'm definitely not considering myself an expert in CSS. All right, now this one's probably going to cause a few of you to call BS on me, but I'm going to absolutely tell you that I'm an imposter at JavaScript. Many of you have read my books, and you might not know that one of the main reasons why I titled the You Don't Know JS books that way is because somebody told me back earlier in my career after I was already a conference speaker and had already written a book on JavaScript, they said, I don't think you know much JavaScript. And it turns out they were right. I didn't know much JavaScript. And so I sat down and started asking a bunch of questions about the JavaScript language, and then I just did something that not a lot of other people did, which is I publicly documented all the questions and answers in the form of these books. So when I started the book series, I was absolutely 100% an imposter in JavaScript, and I'm maybe like 5% less imposter today. Because I just asked a whole bunch of questions about the language. And guess what? I've forgotten most of what I learned. I get people coming up to me and like quoting, like, on page 137, you said this. I'm like, I clearly said it. My name's on the cover. I wrote it, but like, I don't remember that. But it goes beyond just my learning. This is JavaScript that I wrote very recently in that Dwordly game. I had an algorithm for like figuring out the words in the dictionary. And you'll notice that I'm not doing any of the fancy stuff that people are supposed to do. Like, I don't know how to write TypeScript, so I don't have any types going on in here. And I'm using like the dreaded var keyword and functions and for loops and stuff. This is my JavaScript, so if you think I'm an expert, that's a pretty low bar. Okay? Sorry. Let's talk about another piece of my JavaScript that I've written. So you notice that I have this commented out line. It's maybe hard for those of you in the back, but it's a commented out alert statement. This is as sophisticated as it gets when I'm building UIs, as I use alert boxes. And I was doing this in that surveying app that I was talking about, and I was just about ready to send it out to all those backers, and then I realized, if I leave these alert boxes in, all these people are going to like dunk on me and make fun of me for using alert box and not doing something. So I like Googled and found this thing called Sweet Alert, and I literally just commented on all the alerts and left in all of the calls to the Sweet Alert to pop up a nicer looking box or whatever. And then I realized maybe I should have left in all the alerts, because if the alert box is good enough for the Google Calendar developers, maybe it's good enough for the rest of us. All right, my final section of discussion for the remainder of my talk. This is actually why I got you here, because I want to talk to you about a topic that I don't think gets anywhere near enough attention. By a show of hands, how many of you know what this logo stands for? Okay, that's not nearly enough hands. This is the international logo for accessibility. Okay, and I'm going to talk to you about accessibility, and I know a bunch of you just rolled your eyes and think, oh no, we're going to hear about accessibility. It's so boring. So first off, I'm completely an imposter at accessibility. But there might be one difference between me and you, is that I give a shit about it. And if that feels like I'm going to like get in your face and attack you a little bit, or if it's going to make you a little bit uncomfortable, maybe it ought to feel that way. I had this fantastic conversation with this guy named Andreas Lopez. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He's an advocate in the accessibility community, works specifically in accessibility in gaming. And I had this conversation with him in preparation for this talk some time back. And when we got on this Zoom call together, he stopped before we ever got into any of the rest of it. He stopped and he said, you know what, Kyle? You and I both have a disability. And I was like, really? We have the same disability? And then he took off his eyeglasses and he says, we both have a visual impairment, and we happen to be lucky enough to wear an accessibility tool on our face that allows us to see in ways that we wouldn't without that tool. But there's a whole bunch of people in this world that aren't quite as fortunate to be able to wear their accessibility tool in a nice stylish form on their face. And that really hit me like a ton of bricks, and the whole conversation got even more profound from there. I learned so much from Andreas Lopez. He pointed me at the WCAG 2.x principles. There we go. He pointed me at these principles, and if you have not read the principles of WCAG, the web accessibility group, I forget what the C stands for, sorry, I'm an imposter at that too. Whatever, anyway, the WCAG, they are responsible for the accessibility guidelines, and I think they're coming out with a 3.0 pretty soon, but these are the standard principles that are in play as far as I'm aware right now, and these principles are actually quite instructive. So first of all, you need to make an app, a piece of software, when you're making it, for it to be accessible, it needs to be perceivable. And we usually think of that as a visual thing. But there are 4 other senses that we use besides our eyes, and all of those are different ways that people interact with various different applications. So you need to not only make it visually accessible, but also if there's an auditory component, if there's other senses that are involved, you need to make sure to think about what if this person doesn't have full capability with that particular sense. There's also that it needs to be operable. Operable meaning there's mechanical things that we need to do, like if you're playing a game on a video controller, you need to actually be able to use your thumbs or your fingers to operate the buttons on the control, or operate a mouse, or operate a trackpad, or use a touch interface. So there's physical things, and not all of us have the exact same capabilities in terms of being able to do that. And so we need to be thinking about, what if I build a touch-enabled interface and somebody doesn't have fingers to use, or maybe their fingers are broken because they're in a cast, right? Because not all accessibility challenges are permanent. Sometimes they're just temporary things. Somebody with 2 good arms who breaks an arm and has a child that they're holding now doesn't have arms available, but that doesn't mean that they're not your same customer as they were yesterday when they bought a product from your site. They just have a temporary condition that's an accessibility challenge, and we should be thinking about those people. Understandable means that we have cognitive challenges that some of us face, where things are moving too quick, or there's too much information on the screen, or things transition or animations or whatever, and they can cause cognitive issues. And most of us probably are not thinking, what happens if this really nice fancy interface is so confusing to someone with a cognitive challenge, they have no idea what's going on. They have nothing wrong with their visual system, but their cognition may not be able to track all of those changes so quickly. And we probably didn't put down in a thing that said we can slow down the animation rate for things popping in. And my favorite one is the being robust. We talked about responsive design. It turns out that some people have to use different kinds of devices because that's the only way that they can access that thing. Somebody may have to use a phone, or may have to use a tablet, or may have to use a computer. I'm super privileged that I get to own all 3 of those things and choose at will which one I want. But not everybody has that same privilege. Some people don't have that same privilege to be able to choose freely among these devices. So why am I talking to you so much about this accessibility? Why did I put this at the end of this talk? Not only because I consider myself to be an imposter at accessibility, but because I'm concerned that we as builders of the web are not living up to the responsibility that that title gives us. Let me ask you a question. This is not a real question that I want to answer to. It's a rhetorical one. But I want to ask you this rhetorical question. When was the last time that anyone on your developer team went to a client or a boss, a product manager, or something like that, and had a conversation like, hey, we need more time in the budget so that we can configure all of our linters and build tools and Webpack and all that stuff. We got to get our Docker containers in order. We need more time in the schedule for that. And oh, by the way, we need more time so that we can switch from React to Vue. And oh, by the way, we need this and this and this. When was the last time you had any conversation where you asked them anything about developer experience? And I'm going to answer for that for you, never. You've never once had that conversation. Why? Because you as developers, just like me, don't treat that stuff as optional. You say, this is how I do my job. I have to have these tools to build my job. You can't possibly expect me to build for the web without all of my fancy tools and my build chain and all this stuff. So you don't make it optional. And my question is, why is it that we're taking one of the most fundamental characteristics, that it can be used by fellow human beings, and we're making that optional? Why do we have to go and ask our clients and our bosses and our project managers and beg them for an extra 5 minutes to put an alt tag on an image tag? Why do we have to beg for that? Why is it that we're not just telling them, sorry, that's not optional. When I build for the web, I build accessible, period, end of story. Thank you for clapping. You see, because it may feel like I'm beating you up right now, but I'm absolutely in the same boat. Let me show you an example. This is the kind of stuff that I built. And it's literally, the bar is that I gave a shit. And I did a little bit of Googling to try to figure out what ARIA labels do I need, like role and ARIA label and a few of these others. I just Googled, I probably didn't even do it right. I'm probably not doing accessibility the correct and proper and most fulsome way that I could, but I cared enough to try. And I know some of you are saying, well, that's all well and good, but I'm not going to be able to convince my boss. And my response again is, don't ask them. Just do it, because It's required as part of your job. And if you don't think that's part of your job, you and I just disagree on the fundamental nature of what we're doing. We are building the most inclusive platform, the biggest tent that mankind has ever experienced. And it's us. It's like a few tenths of a % of humanity that's responsible for building that for all the rest of mankind. I think that responsibility falls on us. Now, I try to live what I speak. So even the slides, I spent an extra hour going through and putting in alt text for every single image in these slides. You're not interacting with that file, so you might think that seems like a complete waste of time, right? Because you're not seeing any of that alt text that I put into there. But somebody someday may download a PDF of my slides and may be visually impaired, and I'd like for them to be able to understand what these images are. So I spent the extra hour to put that in. I talked a little bit ago about color ratios. I don't know any of the math and the science behind contrast ratios, but I know it exists. And fantastic Leah Veru, super smart, built this website called contrastratio.com. And I just went in and put in my color codes and then checked the output to see that it was like good enough. For some definition that I don't even fully understand, it says, I don't know what 4.93 means, but green means good, I think. So they're like, hey, that color contrast works. So when I designed these slides, I made sure that the color contrast was appropriate. That didn't take that much extra time. You just, again, the bar is you just have to give a shit. You just have to care a little bit more. And you have to make it not an optional thing. This is not a nice to have. This should be fundamentally built in to what we do. Now, I know many of you are saying, well, if you have the budget, if you've got the big company, they can afford to do that. A lot of you are probably like independent developers, you're working on small teams with small budgets, and you're probably thinking, this is totally impractical. So I'm going to talk to you about Wordle. I mentioned that earlier. I don't know if any of you have taken a look, done a view source on Wordle, or if you've checked Wordle's designs against the contrast ratio. But it turns out it fails almost every single contrast ratio requirement that there is. Now, there may be somebody here that even works on this team, and I apologize if I hurt your feelings for calling this out. I love this game, and every single day that I play it, I just go and double check and see, have they done anything to fix the accessibility issues? They certainly didn't have any trouble putting lots of money and lots of developer talent. I know many people that work for New York Times, when they bought Wordle, they got lots of smart people working on it, and they didn't have any trouble putting their logo into it and like 1,500 different trackers into it. But as far as I can tell, they haven't done a single thing to improve the accessibility of one of the most widely played games in the entire history of the web. Millions and millions and millions of people are using this, and what scares me is there's millions of people not using it because they can't. They'd love to, but they can't. And it goes beyond the contrast ratio. When you dig in, and I know many of you love these custom components and the shadow roots and all that stuff, do you have any idea what screen readers do with that kind of stuff when you're trying? I turned on a screen reader to try to figure out what was going on, and it's a total nightmare to figure out what's happening. Now, you're saying, well, this is a little bit unfair for you to pick on this guy that was an individual who built this game for his girlfriend. That's the story as far as I understand this guy. Josh built it for his girlfriend. This individual, he built it for his girlfriend, and it's no big deal that he didn't think about accessibility. I'll push back on that a little bit and say, I don't know him at all. Maybe he's here today, I don't know. I don't know Josh. I don't know Josh's girlfriend at all. So I apologize if I'm out of line here. But I'm just going to go out on a limb a little bit and guess that Josh's girlfriend doesn't have any accessibility challenges, or at least not obvious ones. Because if she did, he probably would have given a shit to build it more accessible. So they're privileged enough, except what happens tomorrow if she comes up with a temporary condition? And all of a sudden, the game that he built to show how much he loved her is no longer quite as usable to her. And again, my point is, if we don't blame Josh, why aren't we blaming the New York Times? They certainly have plenty of money and plenty of talent to do so. But I still think it starts with someone like Josh, just like it starts with you here in the crowd today. Because those decisions flow through. Josh didn't think about this stuff or didn't care enough to address these things when he was building this little toy game for his girlfriend, but it flowed through to now this multi-trillion-dollar, international company still running an inaccessible game. All right, I'm just about out of time, but I've got one last concept that I want to pitch to you. I want you to imagine in your head, because there's a lot of excuses that people make for why we don't build stuff accessibly. One of the excuses is that, well, I work on a thing that's just not possible to be accessible, so we don't worry about it, we don't budget it. It's so complex that there's no way that you could possibly imagine a screen reader working with it or whatever. You know, it's like the Photoshop of the web, or maybe your brain goes to like gaming, like 3D shooter games. Like there's no way for that to be accessible. Turns out actually that there's lots of talent and lots of skill put into making games even like that accessible. When I was talking with Andreas, he said there are platform tools like on Xbox and PlayStation, and there are good game developers that spend some effort trying to make them a little bit more accessible, even for people that may be in those difficult situations, and there's a ton of complexity to that. But if you can make a 3D first-person shooter somewhat more accessible, I don't think we have any excuse on the web. The web is actually accessible by default, and we're the ones that come along and mess it up because we have the wrong priority. Or rather, we haven't put that high enough priority. We've left it into the optional bin. So I want to pose this as a thought experiment for you to chew on. This is something that does not exist, but I want to exist. I have this idea for a game, and I call it Impostorism. It's a terrible name, right? But here's what this game is. So the game is an RPG where you're playing these characters, and each of these characters has different challenges, different skills, and that should sound like all RPGs, because you get the magician that knows this spell or whatever. We're going to do it, but they're going to be for physical disabilities. And more importantly than that, when you play the game as the character that has that disability, you have to use the accessibility tool to actually play that part of the game. I think this could exist, and I think it would totally change the game, pun intended, on the way we think about accessibility, because if you could build something like that and make that accessible, nothing else on the web would have any excuses left. I do not have the requisite skills to build something like that. I don't have the graphics design skills and the platform building skill. I don't have the full skills to do this, but I have a passion for this topic. And if there's anybody out there that's listening that thinks like this should happen, you don't even need to wait for me, just go make this happen, but I'd love to be part of helping make it happen. If somebody else or some other group of people wants to push the ball forward in terms of this accessibility. All right, so let me wrap up by reintroducing myself. Hi, I'm Kyle, and I'm an imposter. But I didn't let that stop me from learning and doing and trying to push the web a little bit further forward. Thanks very much for listening to this talk.